Have you ever felt you were born at the wrong time? It's a common, wistful daydream. Perhaps you imagine yourself clad in the shimmering glamour of the roaring 20s, dancing the night away to a live jazz band. Or maybe you picture yourself in the revolutionary swirl of the 1960s, a part of a counterculture movement that reshaped the world. This longing for a past we've never known has a name: rosy retrospection. It's a trick of the mind, a psychological phenomenon where our brains tend to sand down the rough edges of history, leaving only a smooth, polished memory. We remember the art, the music, the triumphs, but conveniently forget the rampant diseases, the lack of basic sanitation, and the brutal social inequalities that defined most of human existence. But what if we flip the script? Instead of asking about the best time to be alive, let's ask a much darker question. What was the absolute worst time to be a human being on planet Earth? Immediately, our minds leap to the usual suspects, the great tragedies that dominate our history books. Surely, it must be the years of the Second World War, living under the constant threat of annihilation and the horrifying shadow of the Holocaust. Or perhaps the era of the First World War, with its generation of young men lost to the mud-filled trenches, the ghostly hiss of mustard gas, and the subsequent Spanish flu pandemic that killed more people than the war itself. And who could forget the 14th century, when the Black Death swept across Eurasia like a specter, claiming up to half of Europe's population in a storm of fever and fear? These were, without question, times of unimaginable suffering. And yet, according to a growing consensus of medieval historians and climate scientists, none of these eras hold the grim title of the absolute worst time to be alive. That distinction belongs to a year most of us have never even heard of. A year with no world war, no famous tyrant, no single catchy name for its plague. That year was 536 AD. What could possibly have happened in the year 536 to make it more dreadful than the horrors of the trenches or the devastation of the bubonic plague? The answer is as terrifying as it is simple. It wasn't a war declared by man, but a war waged by the sky itself. It was a time when the sun vanished, the crops failed, and a chilling, perpetual twilight fell across the known world. This is the story of that year, and the beginning of what was, quite literally, humanity's darkest age. The horror of 536 wasn't marked by a single thunderous event, but by a slow, creeping dread that began in the heavens. For those living through it, it must have felt like the end of days, a divine punishment of inexplicable proportions. We don't have to imagine their terror. They recorded it for us with chilling clarity. The most vivid account comes from a prominent Byzantine historian named Procopius, who was living in Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. In his writings, he describes the year with a sense of awestruck bewilderment. For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, he wrote, like the moon, during this whole year. Imagine that. For a full year, and then some, the very source of life and warmth was reduced to a pale, useless disk in the sky. Procopius continued, painting a scene of profound despair. It seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. In this dim, gray world, life itself seemed to lose its substance. Even at high noon, shadows on the ground were faint or non-existent. Men and women moved through a world that had lost its contrast, its vibrancy, its very definition. This wasn't just a local phenomenon confined to the Mediterranean. It was global. Across the world, other witnesses chronicled the same terrifying anomaly. In Ireland, the Gaelic annals recorded a failure of bread from the years 536–539. In distant China, under the northern and southern dynasties, court chroniclers wrote of a strange, dry fog, yellow dust that rained from the sky, and, most shockingly, snow that fell during the summer months, devastating the harvest. Cassiodorus, a Roman statesman in Italy, wrote of a society gripped by anxiety. We marveled to see no shadows of our bodies at noon. He lamented, describing a sun with a bluish color and a sky where even the moon was robbed of its splendor. He spoke of seasons that seemed jumbled together and a frost that withered crops in the middle of summer. People, he noted, felt no hunger, a strange and ominous detail that likely spoke more to their profound psychological shock and depression than a lack of physical need. The immediate consequence of this dim sun event was catastrophic. The global temperature plummeted. Modern climate data, reconstructed from tree rings, shows that the summer of 536 saw a drop of between 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius, kicking off the single coldest decade in the last 300 years. This sudden, sharp plunge into a mini ice age brought agriculture to a grinding halt. From the fertile fields of the Roman Empire to the rice paddies of China, crops failed on a massive scale. The failure of bread in Ireland wasn't a poetic metaphor, it was a stark reality. Famine, the oldest enemy of humankind, began to stalk the land on a continental scale, not as a seasonal hardship, but as a relentless, multi-year siege. The world of 536 was a world that was cold, dark, and starving. For centuries, the harrowing accounts from 536 and the years that followed remained a chilling but poorly understood historical curiosity. Procopius and his contemporaries knew what they saw: the dim sun, the cold, the failed harvests, but they had no way of knowing why it was happening. They attributed it to the wrath of God or some inexplicable celestial portent. It would take nearly 500 years and the advent of modern science to finally shine a light on this ancient darkness. The key to unlocking the mystery wasn't found in a dusty archive or a forgotten manuscript, but frozen deep within a glacier high in the Swiss Alps. The breakthrough came from an unlikely collaboration between a medieval historian at Harvard University, Michael McCormick, and a glaciologist from the University of Maine's Climate Change Institute, Paul Majewski. Their work highlights how interdisciplinary science can solve puzzles that history alone cannot. Majewski and his team had perfected a method for studying the past by drilling into ancient ice. Glaciers and ice sheets, formed by millennia of accumulating snowfall, act as perfect time capsules. Each layer of ice traps a sample of the atmosphere from the year it fell, preserving microscopic particles of dust, ash, sea salt, and man-made pollutants. By drilling a long core of ice and analyzing it layer by layer, scientists can create a year-by-year atmospheric history of the Earth. Using a new, ultra-high-resolution technique involving lasers, the team meticulously analyzed an ice core from the Colle Nefeti Glacier. As they moved backward in time, examining each sliver of ice representing a season, they hit something remarkable in the layer corresponding to the spring of 536 AD. Embedded in the ice were two microscopic particles of volcanic glass, or tephra. This was the smoking gun. The chemical makeup of these particles pointed to a volcanic origin, and their presence proved that a massive volcanic eruption had occurred somewhere in the northern hemisphere at precisely that time. The science behind the dim sun was suddenly crystal clear. A colossal volcanic eruption far larger than most in recorded history had blasted an enormous plume of ash, sulfur, and other particles high into the stratosphere. Unlike normal weather, which occurs in the lower troposphere, particles in the stable, cloudless stratosphere don't get rained out. Instead, they spread globally and can linger for years. This volcanic debris formed a vast, translucent aerosol veil that wrapped around the planet. This veil acted like a planetary sunshade, reflecting sunlight back into space before it could reach and warm the Earth's surface. This phenomenon, now known as a volcanic winter, was the cause of the perpetual twilight, the plunging temperatures, and the agricultural collapse that Procopius and others had so grimly described. The mystery of 536 had been solved, not by an archaeologist's spade, but by a scientist's laser, revealing the cataclysmic power of a single geological event to alter the course of human civilization. The volcanic eruption of 536 was not just a single, terrible year of suffering. It was the first domino in a chain reaction of calamity that would push the Western world into a centuries-long period of stagnation and decline. The volcanic winter was the trigger, but its consequences cascaded through society, compounding one disaster upon another until civilizations began to crumble. The immediate, effect-widespread famine was devastating enough. A society that cannot feed itself is a society on the verge of collapse. Economies, which in the ancient world were almost entirely based on agriculture, ground to a halt. Trade routes withered as there were no surplus goods to sell. Social structures frayed as communities turned inward, fighting over scarce resources. But the weakened state of humanity left it vulnerable to an even more terrifying foe. The years of cold, darkness, and malnutrition had created the perfect storm for disease. The population's immune systems were suppressed, and their bodies were ill-prepared for the biological horror that was about to be unleashed. In 541 AD, Just 5 years after the sky first went dark, the first cases of a new and terrifying pestilence appeared in the Egyptian port of Pelusium. Carried by fleas on the rats that traveled along the Roman grain ships, the bacterium Yersinia pestis began its deadly march across the Mediterranean. This was the first great pandemic of bubonic plague, known to history as the Plague of Justinian, named after the Byzantine emperor who himself contracted and, remarkably, survived the disease. Under normal circumstances, the plague would have been horrific, but striking a population already crippled by a decade of starvation, it was apocalyptic. The historian Procopius, who had chronicled the dim sun, now found himself bearing witness to a pestilence of almost unimaginable scale. He described a disease that left its victims with raging fevers, delirium, and the telltale agonizing swellings or buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck. In Constantinople, the death toll was so high that bodies were left piled in the streets. At its peak, Procopius claimed that 10 people were dying in the capital city every single day. While that number may be an exaggeration, modern estimates suggest the pandemic wiped out between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire. This 1-2 punch of climate disaster followed by pandemic was a blow from which the classical world would never fully recover. The Byzantine Empire was severely weakened, its treasury bankrupted, and its armies depleted, halting its ambitions to reunite the lost Western Roman Empire. In Europe, the societal collapse that began with the famines of the late 530s accelerated dramatically. Cities shrank, economies deurbanized, and the sophisticated networks of the Roman era fell into disrepair. This period, from roughly 536 through the mid-600s, is what scholars now point to as the true beginning of the Dark Aegean era, defined not just by political fragmentation, but by a demonstrable decline in population, economic activity, and living standards, all set in motion by a single volcanic eruption on the other side of the world. Our journey into the past began with a simple, almost romantic question about being born in the wrong time. It led us away from the familiar battlefields and plagues of our history textbooks and into the heart of a forgotten global catastrophe. We have traveled from the bewildered courts of Constantinople to the frigid fields of Ireland, and finally, deep into the frozen heart of a Swiss glacier. The story of 536 AD is a powerful testament to how history, archaeology, and cutting-edge climate science can converge to illuminate the darkest corners of our collective past, revealing a narrative far more complex and interconnected than we ever imagined. The year the sun went out was not just a historical anecdote, it was the catalyst for a century of human misery, the confluence of climatic shock, famine, and pandemic that truly defined humanity's bleakest era. The tale of 536 serves as a profound and humbling reminder of the fragility of human civilization. We build empires, construct complex economies, and develop intricate technologies that give us a sense of mastery over our world. Yet, the story shows us that the entire edifice of our society rests upon a remarkably delicate foundation of climatic stability. A single geological event happening without warning in a remote part of the globe had the power to dim the sun, starve nations, and pave the way for a plague that would alter the trajectory of history. It proves that we are not separate from our environment, but inextricably bound to it. This lesson from over 500 years ago resonates with startling relevance today. As we face our own global challenges from anthropogenic climate change and the risk of future pandemics to the ever-present, if dormant, threat of a supervolcanic eruption, the ghost of 536 looms as a cautionary tale. It underscores the critical importance of global awareness, scientific understanding, and a deep-seated humility in the face of nature's immense power. It reminds us that interconnectedness is a double-edged sword. Just as a volcanic veil could spread globally then, our modern crises know no borders now. In the end, the story of the worst year to be alive is not just about the darkness and despair of the past, it is a reflection on the present and a question posed to our future. It forces us to look at the sky, the seasons, and the stability we so often take for granted, and to ask ourselves a new question. Have we truly learned the lessons written in the ice? And is the foundation of our own brilliant, bustling age any less fragile than we believe it to be?